And I think the definition that is my favorite, there's an amazing psychologist called John Amici, who's a huge influencer in terms of workplace culture, leadership, and inclusion. And he defines culture as the worst behavior tolerated. And I think this is really a powerful definition because I think often organizations will focus on the positive behaviors and values they have in their organization, how that shapes culture. But the reality is, if we've got behaviors in the organization that aren't being monitored and are continuing to be tolerated, that's what's really gonna shape the organizational culture.
Welcome to Inclusion and Marketing, the show that's all about helping you uncover the skills and insights you need to win the attention, adoration, and loyalty of more consumers, especially those with differences that are often ignored by brands. I'm your host, Sonia Thompson, an inclusive brand coach, strategist, and someone with a lot of differences. Let's get to it. Did you know that most businesses only use 20% of their data? That's like reading a book with most of the pages torn out or paying for a coffee that's just 1/5 full. Point is, you miss a lot unless you use HubSpot. Their customer platform gives you access to the data you need to grow your business. The insights trapped in emails, call logs, and transcripts, all that unstructured data that makes all the difference. Because when you know more, you grow more. And when you get a full cup of coffee, you can do more too. But I digress. Visit HubSpot.com today. One of the things I firmly believe is that you can't build an inclusive brand without building an inclusive culture. It's really hard to authentically attract and retain customers from underrepresented and underserved communities if you do a poor job of attracting and retaining talent from underrepresented and underserved communities. That's why company culture is one of the 5 pillars in my framework of building an inclusive brand. As a quick aside, I cover that framework in great detail in my program, Inclusive Brand Academy. Go to inclusivebrandacademy.com for more details. Now, because workplace culture is such an imperative, I'm thrilled to bring you this chat with today's guests, Leanne and Al Elliott, hosts of the Truth, Lies, and Workplace Culture podcast and co-founders of a workplace culture consultancy, OblongHQ. Leanne is a certified business psychologist and leadership coach, and Al is a serial entrepreneur, a great marriage of theory and practice, which also works well because they are a married couple. Our conversation was so good. Like, I remember listening to Leanne explain something and being so excited I could hardly contain myself. I just wanted to dig in more. I completely nerded out and loved every minute of the chat with these two. I trust you will as well. So without further ado, here's Leanne and Al. All right. Hello, Al and Leanne. Thanks so much for joining me. How are you today?
Really good. Thank you for having us. We're excited.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's going to be great.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. I am really excited for this discussion. I can talk about culture all day, every day, and just the role that it plays in building an inclusive brand. But before I start, getting too excited, let's just pause and bring the people in. Who are you and what do you do?
My name's Al. I'm a business owner. And as you'll hear, if you listen to our podcast, you'll hear that I never say that I'm the expert. I'm definitely not the expert. I'm here to learn from Leanne, who is the expert.
He's also here to translate some of the too sciencey things I say into the real business world. Yeah, my name is Leanne. I'm a business psychologist and leadership coach. And together we've co-founded Oblong, which is a people and culture consultancy, and the Truth, Lies, and Workplace Culture podcast, which is also part of the HubSpot podcast network.
Lovely. I think that we do need more people and culture consultancies, just because if I think back to my days at corporate and just hearing the many stories of people that you interact with who still work in corporate environments, who just have jobs, period, and the things that they have to go through, the stories they have of not so good experiences, just kind of reiterate, especially given the time that we spend at work, how important it is to focus so much on people and culture and building a good culture that makes people feel like they belong.
Absolutely. And one thing that we say on our podcast, it's simplifying the science of people. This type of thing can feel overwhelming for for business leaders, business owners that have grown their company and perhaps don't have that expertise. So that's what we're all here for, is just to help you on your journey to creating an environment in which people can thrive.
Absolutely. All right. Well, a lot of people might have varying thoughts on this. So before we get too down the rabbit hole, can you just talk about what is your definition of workplace culture?
It's a good question. I think there are more than 100 definitions of workplace culture. Psychologists can never agree, and they'll always say it depends. But I think for me, if we look at kind of the APA definition, then it's very much focused around thoughts, behaviors that are shared by members of the same organization. Often these are talked about through the lens of language, values, attitudes, customs. My issue comes that there's been a little bit too much focus for me on the latter. So things like ping pong tables in the break room, or quirky job titles like content monkeys instead of copywriters. So I prefer to focus on the kind of the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviors that are shared to create workplace culture.
How did we get to the point to where culture became, like you said, those ping pong tables and the food that they offer at the office and things like that?
Yeah. I think often it's a misunderstanding between the intent behind some interventions, particularly that large organizations will do, and what it actually means. So I think ping pong tables or really cool breakout areas probably came from inspiration of organizations like Google or Apple that have these big complexes. The psychology behind it is actually having a space that encourages people to take breaks, where they can disconnect, they can reflect, they can think, they can innovate. They might do that over a game of ping pong table. But the intent is that people are encouraged to take breaks, not to have a ping pong table in the break room.
And I think also a lot of people, business owners, are looking for that quick solution. And so they can dive into what people and culture means and go, well, I've got enough problems at the moment, so let's throw a ping pong table in and we're doing our bit. And I think that's something which hopefully is changing, and it feels like it's changing. But definitely over the last 10 years, it felt a bit like we'll do that. And then that's our culture.
Right. Yeah. And I think people probably sort of lean into, we want to have a fun culture. We want to have a fun place where people enjoy coming to work. But enjoyment doesn't necessarily equate to I get to play games or I get to eat whatever I want. There are other bigger sort of issues. Thinking about basic psychological safety, if you don't have psychological safety, but you have a ping pong table, it's not quite, what we're looking for.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing, that often when we talk about culture, it can feel a bit intangible, which is why I prefer to focus it on things that can be measured, like these beliefs, these attitudes, these behaviors. And I think the definition that is my favorite, there's an amazing psychologist called John Amici, who's a huge influencer in terms of workplace culture, leadership, and inclusion. And he defines culture as the worst behavior tolerated. And I think this is really a powerful definition, because I think often organizations will focus on the positive behaviors and values they have in their organization, how that shapes culture. But the reality is, if we've got behaviors in the organization that aren't being monitored and are continuing to be tolerated, that's what's really gonna shape the organizational culture.
For sure. Oh, that's a really good definition. I feel like I'm gonna have to sit with that one for a little while.
Yeah.
One other question before we dig in a little bit deeper on this is workplace culture. I imagine that there's some people who are like, okay, this is something that is established by leadership at the top of the organization. And they, if you're a business leader and you've got your own team, you might say, I can't control that. Are there elements or ways that people can sort of create their own team culture whenever they don't necessarily have control over the overall workplace organizational culture?
Yeah, absolutely. They're called microcultures, and typically we see them in larger organizations, but not always and not necessarily. We might also see those microcultures between departments, for example. But I think that's a really, leadership is responsible for culture and how those behaviors translate across the organization. But equally, I think often the challenge that leaders have is they don't always vocalize what these values look like in day-to-day practice. So something that an example that we use, if you're looking at, say, an accounting firm, for example, one of your organizations might be to be bold and think outside the box. You might want your marketing team, your communications team to think creatively. As an accountant, you're working within the law, so there's only so much you can do. But equally, you can be creative within the constraints of regulations. I think it's actually leaders taking the time to translate what that value means for each individual role within the business and the types of behaviors they expect to see along with that value. And that's what will shape a cohesive organizational culture.
Love it.
And I think also, like my marketing background, same as yours, Sonia,
Mhm.
I think we can understand it just by thinking about brand. You can say we are the ultra destination for luxurious, but if when they arrive, the bed's rickety, the bathroom's not clean, it's not on brand. So I think it's as
Right.
simple as, there's some really, really in-depth stuff as well. But also on a higher level, are we just, coherent? Are we just is the brand what we think it is?
For sure. Yeah, definitely. Because I think people can have sometimes a disconnect, like you said, between what they think their culture is and what people are actually experiencing. Which kind of leads into the next thing I want to talk to you about is what, from your perspective, makes an inclusive workplace culture?
Mhm. I think, if we think about inclusion, and neither Al or I are experts in diversity, equality, and inclusion. That's not our kind of wheelhouse. But inclusion is a big facet of workplace culture and leadership and these beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors that create these environments in which people can thrive. So if we think about culture as that definition and what makes a workplace culture inclusive, from our research and practice, there seem to be 7 pillars of an inclusive workplace culture where people experience both high performance and sense of belonging, but also positive well-being. So those 7, just to run through them quickly, are reason, role, recognition, relationships, resources, resilience, and remote. So paying attention to these foundations are going to help you build an inclusive culture. And it's as much about the practices within the organization as it is the behaviors and beliefs. They inform each other. So I guess I can give you an example.
For sure.
Perhaps if that would help.
Yes.
So if we look at role, for example, so role is about having clear roles and responsibilities. It's about having autonomy, some freedom in our work practices, and also leaders that understand the challenges that we're facing. But if we break that down to its most transactional part, having roles and responsibilities, what we're talking about there is recruitment. And recruitment in business psychology is the easiest bit because it's data, it's statistics. That's the bit that we can be confident about getting right. But very few organizations will have a very robust and equitable recruitment process in place. So I think organizations with an inclusive culture are going to start their recruitment by actually defining the role that they need within the organization. So I guess for me, that's in terms of what's the scope of this role? What do we need it to do, and how does it function?
Mm-hmm.
And how does it contribute to the business in terms of its performance, in terms of its mission delivery? So if we look at that, that's what's called job analysis. So we think about what the role is, and then we think about the types of knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed for that role. And that can be done through looking at individuals in the past that have done that role particularly well, but also really digging into what made them good at it. So you might go, oh, well, John was great in that role and he was at Harvard. Was it the fact that he had an Ivy League education? Or is it the fact that John was really hungry to learn and open to new ideas? So really breaking down those competencies and translating them into a way that isn't attached to a certain qualification or background is a really good way to create an inclusive recruitment practice. And then once you've got them, that these competencies, you can look at how we measure them. And not all ways of measuring competencies are equal. If we look at, for example, think of a client I used to work with who had a role that had a really strong written and verbal communication aspect to it. And she said to me, I think we need a native English speaker. I said, do we? Because one, that's actually illegal in the European Union to say that.
Oh, wow.
We have to
Okay.
we have to show it, that openness, because it's actually about the ability, not the fact that they're native, but do they have that ability to do the work that's required?
Okay.
So putting in place a work sample test, for example, is going to test somebody's communication and English skills without necessarily saying you have to be a native English speaker. And it's similar when we think about things like psychometrics as well. There's a lot of psychometrics out there that will have bias within them, whether that be cultural bias or the norms that stands aren't quite right to assess people objectively. And that for me really just comes down to, if as an inclusive organization, are we choosing the tools that are going to assess people objectively rather than potentially discriminate against them? So for example, some psychometrics like cognitive mental ability tests or IQ tests can be skewed depending on how the questions are asked, that some people would do better than others. Or we might have things like verbal reasoning tests that will use examples taken from American literature or growing up in an
Mm-hmm.
American society. Whereas if you've emigrated to that environment, you might perform worse in that test, but that's not to say you don't have the ability, you just don't understand the context in which that test is administered. And equally with, personality psychometrics as well, there can be some that aren't quite as scientifically robust as others. So it's looking for those publishing organizations who create the tests. How transparent are they in terms of the bias within the tool? And how are they validating and using and developing and evolving that tool to make sure it is eliminating bias? So that in itself is a very transactional part of an organization and how it recruits people. But even the decisions that you make in there, in that realm, is also going to feed into how inclusive your workplace culture is.
Oh my God. Like, you said so many wonderful things that I'm like, oh, I want to ask you about this. I want to ask you about that. I want to ask you about this. So let me kind of calm myself. And then I want to come back to two things in particular. Let's start with the second thing that you just mentioned about some of these tests, because I remember maybe a couple of years ago, I remember listening, there were a lot of podcasts that were talking about how, oh, it might be great. And they were talking about even smaller businesses, smaller teams. And I remember whenever I worked my corporate job, we did these sort of tests where I think there's Myers-Briggs, there was DISC, and not saying that there are problems with these tests, but I think more and more, and I don't know if people are still using these or leaning into them to evaluate, is somebody going to be a good fit for our team based upon how they score on these tests? Not to say that anyone is right or wrong, but they're trying to use these as a marker of, is this person going to be the fit that we need? Is that more of what you're talking about? Like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be doing those things because they have some biases sort of built into them?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And I think those biases are going to stem from the lack of scientific rigor that a test has behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So taking Myers-Briggs, for example, I make a joke that every time an organization uses Myers-Briggs, a psychologist loses their wings. Because in terms of, and they're very open about it, Myers-Briggs,
Right.
in terms of the science behind it, there isn't really any. No psychologist or scientist was involved in the development of Myers-Briggs. So if that tool is used to make really important decisions like recruitment and promotion, how someone performs on that test or that inventory isn't going to actually reflect how they'll perform in the role or predict how they'll perform in the role. And that's what psychometrics are meant to be used for, to predict how well someone is going to perform in the role. And again, it's not about the individual, it's about how that individual performs in the role.
Yeah.
So if you want to use Myers-Briggs, that's fine for, if we need a common vocabulary to explore how we interact as a team and our differences, then that's okay. But if we're talking about making hard decisions, if we're recruiting somebody in or promoting somebody, the kind of the validity and reliability and rigor behind that test is a fundamental consideration for any organization.
Just a little fun aside on this. Whenever I started my first year out of business school, I went and I was part of this management development program, and they had everybody in the group do the Myers-Briggs. And I'm an INFP. And I remember reading up on it, with the packet of information, and there's 0.3% of CEOs or business leaders are in this type. And I would just remember this has been it's been 20 years. And I still remember reading that in terms of just how some of these things can label people and say, this is how you are. And subconsciously, sometimes those things kind of stick with you and can impact the way you show up, your performance. And so, yeah, I definitely think we need to make sure that these psychologists keep their wings by not using them. Okay. One other thing that you talked about that I want to dig into was more so around evaluating role and the specific skill sets needed versus how are we correlating these naturally to, oh, this person went to Harvard, this person had an MBA, this person had 10 years experience. Because I feel like definitely we need to do a better job of this from an inclusion standpoint, especially as we're thinking about years of experience. Not because years of experience isn't important. I just think that the way in which we learn and we grow these days is accelerated. And as people spend more time laser focused on a particular task, so what somebody can accomplish in 2 years or 6 months, what it might take another person 10 years to do. And somebody who might have a 10-year career, let's say in digital marketing, might not know anything about the way it works, right now with some of the tools right now, that somebody else who's been doing it for 6 months, like hands-on, has a very clear and solid understanding of it. So yeah, like I always kind of felt like those are things that we need to work on getting better at. I know it makes people feel uncomfortable because having those markers makes them feel good about the people that they're bringing on, but yeah, it's not necessarily something that it has to be so rigid. And then we probably open ourselves up to getting a lot more different types of talent whenever we do so.
Absolutely. Al and I come from very different backgrounds. I am from an academic background and Al is from a business background. And there are, skills and competencies that I can't come close to in terms of how Al thinks, about how creative he is, about how he approaches problems and solutions. It's a completely different way of thinking with equal value, depending again on the role and the context of the job that you're doing in the organization you're doing it in.
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard as a business owner because there are these sort of, like you say, it's another ping pong table, Myers-Briggs. Oh, well, that's the way we were going to categorize people. But as you said, that when you learn you're an IN, I don't know what the numbers are and the letters are, what they mean. But when you say you're one of those people, then, as you say, you worry that then that might give you this sort of confirmation bias. Oh, I can't finish things because I'm this type of person.
Yes.
I crashed my car. Oh, I'm a Sagittarius, so, we do that.
Right.
And it's like, and if you're not careful, and it could work really the other way. Someone saying you're a completer finisher, you go, yes, I am a completer finisher, and then you're going to be amazing at that. But like Leanne says, I think we did one of our very first podcast episodes was that I did the Myers-Briggs, and then Leanne read out my results, and she was actually reading from my star sign, Gemini, not from the Myers-Briggs results, and it sounded exactly the same.
Right.
So, you can't categorize people into 16 different personalities, and it's lazy if you think that that's the way you're gonna do things.
Yeah.
And I think the other consideration with these types of psychometrics is their self-report. I'm filling in questions about myself. So the results are going to sound like me because that's how I see myself. That's how I answer those questions.
Right.
Whereas if we ask somebody else, what do you think my strengths are? We'll probably likely get very different answers and identify superpowers that we're not even aware of. So I think that's a consideration as well. If how I see myself is not necessarily how other people see me.
Right. Okay, I've got another podcast recommendation for you. It's Augmenters, hosted by Julie Meyer and Jimmy Edgerton, and it's brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network, the audio destination for business professionals. So on this show, Julie and Jimmy dive into mentoring and explore ways to augment and refresh the mentoring environment. They're using 8 core principles that weave relevant spirit guides and diverse guests, and Julie and Jimmy use a lot of humor and practical tips to help mentors and mentees get further, faster together. There's so many great episodes to tune into for this show, but one that you might find especially interesting is their latest episode, number 120, Mentoring Across Gender, Men as Allies and Mentors. Listen to Augmenters wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, so inclusion is a really big term and loaded term, right? People are starting to think about, okay, I want to build an inclusive culture. There's so many dimensions of diversity and there's so many different types of people. How should people even start to think about it in terms of how to go about doing it? Is it focusing really on those 7 parameters that you had listed previously versus these are all the ways in which people can be different? And how do we find ways to include all these things or make everybody feel like they belong? Is it more so focusing on these are the areas, let's focus on these particular elements of our culture? Is that kind of how people should embrace it?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of your question, where do I start? I think that's a good starting point. It's understanding that, that as you say, those foundations in your culture and how they're currently either supporting inclusion or not. And I think particularly in terms of the 7 I mentioned, one that I'd really probably start with in terms of focusing in it is recognition.
Okay.
And recognition is about providing a psychologically safe environment that's based on fairness, representation, appreciation. There's 3 different elements to it. And I think the one that is maybe the easiest to, most tangible to assess is called organizational justice. That's how a decision's made within your business. And that could be as simple as looking at pay equity between men and women, or, across different roles that are people paid the same. How are decisions made? Do we have a clear assessment process for performance so we can make objective decisions about who deserves that bonus, who deserves that promotion? And the second element of that, which I think is also really important, is employee voice. That's providing opportunities for people to express their concerns, their ideas, without any fear of negative consequence, and then actually using those insights to then shape the culture and the culture improvements that you want to make. So for me, I think as a starting point, recognition is really important. And from a scientific point of view, we know that this foundation of culture translates into positive attitudes and beliefs and behaviors. And in this case, a sense of belonging, feeling attached to the organization, being psychologically safe. But also in terms of, the wider impacts for the organization, that's going to mean that organizations are going to, because people are feeling safe, they're going to report more errors. So mistakes are going to reduce. They're going to be more creative and innovative because they feel able to speak up and put their opinions forward. So it's not even a case of having an inclusive culture through recognition is just going to be really great because that's the ethical and responsible business thing to do. It actually also translates to better outcomes as an individual and also in terms of your business.
Yeah.
And I think also you said, what's the starting point? And as a straight, white, privileged male, I can't for a second sit down and go, right, so I'm going to write my D&I, policy. I can't do that. So we need to start asking for external help. And just by asking the question, how do I do this? Even if it's to your staff or to an expert like you or someone like Leanne, I think that's a great starting point of not just going, oh, well, let's just look at what Google do and I'll sort of Control-C, Control-V. And it's
Right.
like, that's not the way to do it really, to make it authentic.
For sure. And I think it's acknowledging also, so going back to what you were saying about psychological safety and giving people that opportunity to speak up, recognizing that different people speak up in different ways. I was having this conversation with a client recently that I coach them on a regular basis on, just aspects of building an inclusive brand. And I was talking about feedback and when people feel comfortable speaking up. Some people naturally will just offer you their feedback. I hated this. This made me feel comfortable. Whatever it is that they have to say, they're going to say it. Other people have these same thoughts and opinions. They will only give it if you ask them. So it's kind of like you have to go and solicit it. Other people, if you're in that soliciting can be informal. Hey, what do you think? During a meeting, hey, Al, could you provide your perspective? And then other times it might be, letting people know that they can think about it and sit with it, because sometimes people aren't going to be able to have that point of view and they need to process it and give it back to you in an email or a Slack message or something like that. And they'll never be able to give it to you face to face. And I think it's probably just acknowledging that there are a number of ways that people process their thoughts and the way that makes them feel safe enough to provide their point of view. And then just making sure that we don't get so caught up that it has to be in sort of one sort of traditional format to deliver that.
Do you know what's interesting is that I'm kind of naturally tend towards extrovert. Leanne kind of naturally tends towards introvert. And because we've been together 15 years, we're sort of meeting a little bit more in the middle. But I've noticed that I say things out loud when I'm still thinking about them. And Leanne will only say things when she's thought about them. And that was something Leanne pointed out to me maybe about 5, 6, 7 years ago. And I was like, oh, now I understand why Leanne, I ask her a question, she just doesn't say anything. So it kind of speaks to what you said there, that there are differences in the way that you kind of communicate, think, etc. And we need to be a little bit more aware of those, don't we?
Yeah. I think that does give people a more sense of safety and they're not the odd person out if they don't process it out loud the way everybody else does.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Having different, feedback channels is really important, whether it be, if you have a particular problem or challenge you want to consult your employees, giving them, a brief ahead of time, putting people in teams that wouldn't normally work together, to see how that dynamic works in terms of ideation and creativity, having anonymous surveys that go out every quarter to gather feedback. There's so many different ways of doing it. And equally, again, bringing the science back into it, the more different ways we collect feedback, the richer that feedback is going to be, and probably the more insights we're going to have that are useful to actually make effective change within our business. It might take a little bit longer and not quite as instant. I know we can be impatient, But in terms of the quality, we're going to get much more quality. We have different channels of feedback that are going to suit different people.
Yeah. Do you have to announce to people, hey, we're working on our culture? We're trying to change things, because I imagine that there are cultures that exist that could be improved upon. But how should people go about changing a culture that is already one way and established, whether it's the culture they want or not, to know that they're going to be sort of evolving to one that is a bit more inclusive or focuses more so in centering the people?
I think, going back to the earlier point you made in terms of, leaders thinking they have one culture, but that's being kind of translated different ways on the front line. I think it's the first thing is really to understand that you probably don't, as a leader, have a very accurate idea of what your culture is.
Mhm.
You're going to have to bring your employees into that conversation. And equally, you can't possibly understand where you want to go in terms of the future of your culture and how you want to evolve that culture if you don't start by currently understanding where you are right now.
Got it.
So I think there is going to have to be that collaboration with your employees to really understand the nature of your culture. But the upside of that as well is if employees are involved in that process from the beginning, and also in terms of once you have those initial results and thinking about the solutions we want to put in place to make these cultural changes, because they've already been part of the process, that change itself is going to be much more easy for them to get on board with.
Oh, totally agree. When I worked in corporate, the company that I worked for, they did a survey every 2 years. Basically, it was sort of evaluating how well we were performing based upon the stated culture that they wanted to have. And sometimes it felt like, oh gosh, the survey again. But then other times it was, okay, well, they're at least asking, and this is our opportunity to provide feedback and let our voice be heard. Do people need to have something as formal as like a survey, or could it be as informal as just having some conversations?
I think it requires both.
Okay.
The thing about organizational culture, unless we make any significant changes or a change happens to us like a merger or an acquisition, culture is fairly stable. So measuring culture every month via a survey, we don't need to do that. I'd say every 12 months is probably a good timescale, particularly because of all the changes and disruption we've just seen in the world of work over the last few years.
Right.
And I think you do need to have that structured survey in place to get you the data and insights that you need. Equally, and particularly in terms of the change and understanding how that change is working, having those more regular conversations with your people are going to be much more important in the day-to-day aspect of it. And also brings that more personal approach back into it. It's not just about data and numbers and making sure that, hey, we've got an engagement score in 75% this year. That's great. We don't need to do anything. No, it needs to be part of a bigger process. But equally, if you've got those data points that you can see it, you can measure it, you can track the improvements, because we should also be able to predict. So if we know we're making lots of effort to improve psychological safety in the workplace, we should see an uptick in people's experiences of recognition within the workplace. If we're not seeing that uptick 12 months on after we've tried to make these changes, then our intervention hasn't worked.
Got it.
So it's as much as measuring the return on investment as it is gaining up-to-date insights into how your employees are thinking, feeling, behaving. And as we know from our definition, thinking, feeling, and behaving is ultimately what defines your workplace culture.
And it also depends on your motivation for doing it, doesn't it? Because some people want to do a survey because they want to hear good things, not they want to actually hear what's going on. And there's quite a few apps out there, engagement apps out there, who seem to use their marketing to say that buy us and you'll hear good things. Use our survey, you'll hear good things, as opposed to not necessarily what's the truth. And that's difficult because there are a lot of people out there who are like, NPS is my thing, and that's what I'm just working every single day to get that up. Whereas actually, there could be some people who aren't involved in that, who hate your product or your brand, but just keep quiet and just walk away to your competitors. So it's that motivation behind it you have to be a bit careful of, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and you will hear things that you don't want to hear. And equally, if you have no intention of doing anything with that feedback, if you're not going to act on it and make those changes, don't bother. Don't bother gathering it in the first place, because you're going to cause more damage.
Absolutely. Oh, this has been, the time has flown by. There's so much more to talk about. I guess it means we got to have you back so we can continue the conversation. Any parting words of wisdom for business leaders who want to build an inclusive workplace culture?
I think there's three main things for me. As Al said before, engage experts, because you're going to need this expertise if you don't already have it in your business. And there can be a tendency to rely on people within the business because we see them as having the capability or even the demographic profile of what it takes to carry this agenda. And that's not fair. So get the experts in that you need, measure it. This is data. These are things that we can measure. We can predict outcomes with it. We can measure the return on our investment, both in terms of how our employees are thriving, in terms of their well-being and performance, but also in terms of our business, in terms of our revenue and profitability. They're all related. And I think finally, a bit of patience. Change isn't easy for us. It puts us in this threat state. We don't like it. We resist against it. And the psychological transition we need to go through to adopt that change is a much slower process. So I think patience is also a vital thing for leaders.
Absolutely.
I think you just got to also think about what it is you're trying to do. If you're just trying to do it to prove that you're thinking about it, it's going to shine through that it's an empty gesture. If you're going for an exit or someone's looking to acquire you and you go, oh God, I'm going to have to go and do some D&I stuff now. The motivation is there. It's not going to be authentic. And so I think, as Leanne says, you got to do it for the right reasons and you got to do it the right way.
Absolutely. Where can people find you if they want to learn more and even get your support in doing some of these efforts?
Well, the first place is obviously our podcast, Truth, Lies, and Workplace Culture, available like yours is on all of the apps, I think. There is a website, OblongHQ.com. Don't know why we call it Oblong. We just like the sound of the word. So OblongHQ.com, and that's got all the sort of commercial side of it. So you can find a bit more about the consultancy with Leanne and I there.
And connect on LinkedIn. You'll find Al and I there. Get in touch, drop us a message.
Yeah, we'd love to hear from your listeners.
Absolutely. Well, I'll have all that information in the show notes so people can find you easily. Definitely listen to the podcast. It's super insightful and helpful, and you all cover a lot of great stuff. And I love the examples are more global because you all are based outside of the U.S. You're British, but you're in Croatia. So I always like getting the perspective of, what's happening in other parts of the world, because sometimes I think we can get very focused on where we are. And so it's nice to see that some of these problems are universal.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Awesome. Thank you again for stopping by, and we look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Sonia.
Thank you, Sonia.
Leanne and Al had so many wonderful things to share, and there's one thing in particular I'd love you to focus on so you can take action on what you learned, and that's on getting the data about where you stand currently on having an inclusive culture. As Leanne mentioned, perception and reality can be two different things, so it's important that you get an accurate read on your culture based upon what your team thinks rather than what you feel. Brainstorm some ways to capture feedback from your team and understand what their experiences are like so you can get a baseline of where you stand and start working on a plan for where you need to go. Oh, and one more thing. Leanne and Al were so gracious as to provide a really fantastic resource for you all about that RX7 framework for building an inclusive brand. So I'm going to add it into the show notes so you can access it very quickly. It's really thorough and it's really great. It'll really help you get started. So go grab it. That's it for today's episode. If you enjoyed the show, I'd love it if you share it with a friend, colleague, or within your network. Another way to share how you feel about the show is to leave a rating and review for it in your podcast player of choice. All of those actions go a long way toward helping more people discover the show and get on board with building a more inclusive world. And if you'd like to get even more immersed in these topics, head on over to inclusionandmarketing.com and get signed up to receive the Inclusion and Marketing newsletter. Each week, I send stories, insights, examples, and events happening in the world of inclusion and marketing to help you stay in the know and keep it top of mind. Until next time, remember, everyone deserves to have a place where they belong. Let's use our individual and collective power to ensure more people feel like they do. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you soon.